On October the 15th and 16th, 1954, one of Canada's worst hurricanes blew in with monster winds and epic rainfall, destroying homes, roads, bridges and lives. On Tuesday, October 15th, 2019, on the 65th anniversary of that event, at the annual Hurricane Hazel Heritage Talk, Rhianydd Phillips of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority presented an extremely informative and thought-provoking talk on the impact of Hurricane Hazel on the river systems of Toronto and the steps taken to mitigate further such events. What follows is the talk in its entirety, recorded that evening. We hope that you enjoy this informative presentation discussing and dissecting the impact of Hurricane Hazel on the residents of the area.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Hurricane York, I wish to welcome you here for our Hurricane Hazel evening. We'll start out with the land acknowledgement. Heritage York acknowledges the land we are on, we're part of and subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, including along the Humber River. We also acknowledge this land has been sacred territory to the ancestral Wendat and Tiarantani First Nations, Haudenosaunee peoples, and more recently Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including Métis, and we celebrate the covenant which binds all generations to protect and care for these sacred lands on which we gather today. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that you can become a Heritage York member. The forms are in the other room, and you need to fill it out and give us some money, and you're in. Now, I would like to introduce Maura Welsh. She is an investigative reporter with the Toronto Star and did a lot of coverage of the high water last spring and Maura?
Thank you. Last spring, I wrote a story about climate change and flooding that also turned out to be about infrastructure. The reality is that all three are intimately linked, particularly in the older parts of our city where storm sewers or man-made waterways like Black Creek have narrow culverts that are quickly overwhelmed when hit with intense rainfall. These weather patterns, colloquially known at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority as ninja storms, are going to be part of our future. While Hurricane Hazel resulted in flood management policies, these modern-day ninja storms that sit over a slice of our city, rain with intensity, and then quickly disappear are linked to our new warming climate. And they expose the need to better manage city infrastructure above and below ground. When my story ran, leading off the Star's Undeniable series on climate change, that was the name of the series, Undeniable, I was not sure how people would react. But our analytics show that the public was fascinated by the topic of infrastructure and ninja storms and how it was impacting the city of Toronto and the people who live here. In fact, as time passed, people continued to read the story and actually spend a fair amount of time on it, which is something we in newspapers measure these days. So it was really heartening to see that people cared so much about this issue. The reality is that any of us can be affected by these storms at any time. As Councillor Gord Perk said, we are sitting in a city that was built for a climate that no longer exists. Our former environmental commissioner, Commissioner Diane Sachs, blamed the City Hall politics for underinvestment in parking lots with permeable surfaces, holding tanks, and landscaping that directs runoff that turns into flooding, directs it toward trees or other greenery that could be built into hard cityscapes. It's expensive to replace 100-year-old storm sewers that are built under major streets in downtown Toronto, But experts have said that we can go a long way toward mitigating flooding by changing our roads and sidewalks, adding greenery or silvacells below the ground that capture water and hold on to it so each raindrop does not turn into a flood drop, as Environment Canada experts would say. When he released his climate adaptation plan last summer, Toronto's former Chief Resilience Officer spoke about the data being pulled together by a group of organizations, including the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Elliot Capel said that data is a key to a focused approach at change, defining locations that are most vulnerable to stormwater and river flooding, or locations most at risk from old infrastructure, like the narrow bridges near Black Creek that can displace water into surrounding streets and basements. One part of the story that was so compelling, you all know about this, I'm sure, were the two young men who were caught in the elevator. And they actually released their video, because they have video in their office. The video showed them coming in after the fact, and their faces were just gray, and it was just, you know, it just stops you cold to imagine that can just happen to anyone in different circumstances. So when the full story appeared, while the full story from the data hasn't yet been written, Rhianydd Phillips and Rhianydd are here tonight to present the TRCA's perspective on new flood risks. Rhianydd and Rhianna are with the TRCA Flood Risk Department and experts in responding to questions from the Toronto Star over the last year. So here are two experts to tell you what the Toronto region is facing.
Okay, so I'm definitely not the expert. My manager here is the expert, but she's slowly teaching me well.
Yes, the Strawberry House to provide Wi-Fi to make sure that some of our videos run.
So just quickly do that, and then Rhianna?
Well, Rhiannon steps up. Rhiannon is our flood risk outreach coordinator. So part of her role is to spend time speaking to people who live in flood vulnerable areas, trying to share important information, not just about risk, but also about personal preparedness and resilience. And my role is the senior manager of flood risk management, so I help out with what Rhiannon does, in addition to working on our flood forecasting and warning program, as well as working on our flood risk assessment. So Rhiannon will lead us off by looking, at the past and the history of Hurricane Hazel, how that changed flood risk management, and then I'll take over from the present, talking about some of that risk assessment work that we've done and looking ahead, in terms of what we know, what we don't know, and how we can prepare for a changing climate.
Perfect. Yeah, it will connect, so that's okay. I can send the presentation and leave it later. So it's often been said there's no constant like change. Nowhere is that more evident than here in Toronto. For hundreds of years, our city has evolved, its landscape constantly changing upwards and outwards. So floods in particular have been an issue for Toronto ever since we settled here. Floods are a natural process, but they can be expensive, damaging, and costly. They're actually the costliest natural disaster, causing more home insurance claims than any other emergency. So I'm going to look, I know we haven't said this, but I'm going to look back in time, and she's going to look kind of forward in the future. And just so you guys are aware, this is my first public presentation, so feel free to jump in wherever you feel and correct me. I'm definitely new at this. So, people always used to settle near a river, fishing and transportation being one of the main reasons. And at some point, this particular site, Indigenous people discovered an overland shortcut between Lake Ontario and Georgian Bay. This was known as the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, and it was a really important north-southwest for both the Indigenous people, Europeans, and it followed parts of the Humber River. So, as much as water is a resource for people living nearby, it's also a hazard. So the first written account of a flood in the region dates back to 1797, but the first severe flood hit the region in 1878. 5 inches of rain fell in less than 7.5 hours, causing severe damage to downtown Brampton. And this area actually flooded again in 1948. So these are the photos from the 1948. It's extremely hard to find flooding photos from 1767 or 1797. So conservation authorities have always been, were established in 1946 under the Conservation Authorities Act. Though TRCA was not yet established, the Conservation Authority actually consisted of 4 smaller CAs within the region made up by our watersheds. So you can see here the Humber River CA, Etobicoke-Mimico Creek CA, Don River, Rouge, Dufferin Highlands, and Petticoat Creek CA. It wasn't until 1957 when they merged together to create one single Metro Toronto Conservation Authority. And then we eventually just lost the Metro. So high water marks from floods have been measured for planning purposes as far back as the civilization of ancient Egypt. The regulatory floodplain is the approved standard used in a particular watershed to define the limit of the floodplain for planning purposes, or to define to limit regulation or development. This standard is defined by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And within TRCA's jurisdiction, the regulatory flood plain is either the more severe of the regional storm or the 100-year storm. And for Ontario, that storm took place 65 years ago today. So Hurricane Hazel remains the most severe storm, the most severe flood in recorded history. Between October 5th and 16th, 1954, Hurricane Hazel formed in the tropics and tracked through the interior of the United States and moved across the Great Lakes, where it merged with a cold front and dropped record amounts of rainfall on the Greater Toronto area. It was unfortunate that the area had also received above average rainfall in that month, so the area or the ground was already saturated at the time. So it was on October 15th, 1954, so today, 65 years ago today, when it struck southern Ontario. It was actually projected to dissipate, but instead re-intensified unexpectedly and rapidly, pounding the Toronto region with 110-kilometer winds and 285 millimeters of rain in less than 48 hours. This disaster was a huge wake-up call for Canadians because they really didn't think that it was their problem. They thought that this was an American issue, that hurricanes didn't affect us. So this is a storm track of Hurricane Hazel. The weather office at the time, it was Dominion, so Environment Canada, warned of Hazel's arrival throughout the day on Friday, October 15th. So they stressed the importance of, stressed the heavy rainfall, and the information was disseminated through news reports by Chief Meteorologist Fred Turnbull, and their forecasts were actually quite accurate. Yet many people did not feel that they were adequately warned of this risk, and few people had personal knowledge of hurricanes and the associated impacts, so they did not react or they did not act accordingly. By 4:30 p.m., rain began to fall heavily, resulting in major traffic in the rush hour. It wasn't until 9 p.m. when Highway 11 between Bradford and Toronto was cut into 6 places by floodwaters. So on October 16th, 1954, was when the police received their first call for assistance outside assistance by Western Road at 12:50 a.m. At this time, the Humber River was rising so rapidly that 40 highways and main roads were underwater within the city. Passenger trains were knocked off their tracks, and all traffic to and from Toronto was banned by provincial police. The Metro chairman at the time, Frederick E. Gardner, immediately requested provincial and federal assistance, and I believe that the Lambton house was used as a base for search and rescue.
Oh, this is the video.
Yeah.
Is it working now?
Okay, so this was supposed to be a 3D rendering of the flooding that came into Raymore Drive. So I can send that over to Madeline, and you're welcome to email it out. It's also on our website, and we have a storyboard that our GIS people created. Looks like I'm just having some problem with the internet, so my apology for that. But Raymar Drive was actually hit hardest by Hurricane Hazel, particularly located in the floodplain of the Humber River. It's suffered the greatest loss of life and property damage. The river rose and flooded the lower portion of Raymar Drive, destroying 14 homes and killing 35 people. Complacency was blamed for this tragic number of deaths. Older residents reported us saying that the river has never been this high before. So in total, 81 lives were lost in the GTA and thousands of people were left homeless. Hazel took nearly 1,200 lives over the course of its destruction, and most bridges on the west side of Toronto were destroyed or badly damaged. In total, in Canada, Hazel caused over $135 million in damage. That's $1.3 billion in today's So the devastating impacts of Hurricane Hazel in 1954 was a mobilizing force in a regional approach to flood control and water management in Ontario. A more coordinated approach between conservation authorities, local municipalities, and the province took form after Hazel, and today these organizations play a significant role in the protection of life and property from natural hazards such as flooding. So there was a two-tiered approach. In 1959, the plan for flood control and water conservation consisting of 3 stages was finalized. Several flood control facilities were upgraded or built following Hurricane Hazel, and a rainfall observer network was organized, providing the first ability to forecast and warn against potential flooding. The first part of the stage was the implementation of the land acquisitions program. The intent of this program was to transfer the liability of flood-prone lands from private owners to conservation authorities and buy those lands to build flood infrastructure such as dams and berms. So the second stage was actually building that infrastructure, and that consisted of a $22 million plan in 1959. Between 1959 and 1995 is where these major flood control remedial works were carried out. The first one being Black Creek Dam, which is shown here. This was in 1959, and it's a rock dam. The second one is Clareville Dam, which was in 1964. This also helps protect the residents of the Humber. And then finally, G-Ross Dam in 1973, which is one of our largest dams. And in addition, we built various berms, dikes, and flood control channels across our jurisdiction. So within this process, the final stage was to develop floodplain regulations and update the Conservation Authorities Act. So in essence, the floodplain regulations were implemented to restrict future development and land use for these flood hazard areas, therefore reducing potential damage and risk to human life. And that's where our standard comes in as Hurricane Hazel, the worst case scenario. So let's take a look back at our historical photos of the Lambton house. This is the first one I found. It's in 1937. So our planning policies really have shaped the way this city has developed. Areas such as Raymar Drive flooded so catastrophically that it could no longer be zoned for residential development. And as you can see here, the landscape has definitely changed over the last 50 years, or 65 years. In 1954. In 1983, 1954 and 1983, big difference. 1993, and then today. So now so many areas like this are cherished as green space, but they also play a huge role in flood protection. Unrestricted development within a floodplain increases the risk of loss of life and personal injury and property damage. So these natural areas cleanse water before it enters our rivers and streams, reduces pollution in the air that we breathe, and helps control soil erosion and flooding. So now I'm going to send it over to my manager, Rhianydd Phillips, to talk about the future.
Thanks, Rhianydd. And I thought I heard some questions that I mean, a lot of these areas, sometimes I hear as I'm, driving to work, I'm listening to the radio, and I hear somebody talk about how beautiful and wonderful it is that we have this green space, how the ravines are really the lungs of the city. But few people understand how much of that is actually protected, as a result of the lessons learned through Hurricane Hazel. And so, for me, I see the map. To me, this is what it looks like, because I'm looking at floodplain and flood risk areas. But to most individuals, they only see this, not realizing, the great importance that conservation plays in not just keeping people away from the risk, but also preserving nature's infrastructure. And as Rhianydd was speaking, I did hear a couple of quick questions around some of the flood infrastructure photos that we shared. So I'll just point them out to you on the map and then we'll carry on with it. So somebody, I think I heard the question about Black Creek Dam. So that's a rock check dam. That's upstream of Jane and Wilson, so a little bit farther north in the Black Creek watershed. And that's not the kind of dam that has a reservoir, a large reservoir behind it. It's not the most politically correct term, but in flood control it's called a retardation dam, but what it means is it's slowing down the flow of the water. So it is creating a little bit of storage in the channel upstream of it, but it doesn't have a large reservoir behind it the way that Clairville Dam or G. Rossler Dam would have. So it just slows it down. It's a rock check dam meant to slow the passage of water, and then it works in conjunction with the channel farther downstream of it, which tries to pass the water quickly. Now, some of the channelization that has happened in Black Creek was done prior to Hurricane Hazel and was actually done in order to facilitate, at the time, development at the time. So if you look at some of the neighborhoods surrounding Black Creek, you can see in those aerial photos that actually, the lands in the floodplain were developed and the river was straightened, not because of flood control, because we weren't even working on flood control back then. It was prior to Hurricane Hazel. It was straightened in order to kind of facilitate simpler land division and things like that. Same thing if you think about the Lower Don River. The Lower Don River was straightened in order to facilitate industrial uses and rail access alongside it. So in many cases, a lot of the alterations that have happened to our watercourses happened prior to Hurricane Hazel, prior to us even understanding that it can really overwhelm, the capacity of these channels. In other cases, certain channels were built in order to move the water away very, very quickly. And there was an era after Hurricane Hazel, and this was true of engineering in general at the time, that the idea was let's just control the water. Let's hold it back where we can hold it back, behind those dams, or let's pass it quickly where we can pass it quickly. But these kind of actions actually can create a hazard themselves, because if you're moving the water away quickly from one place, it's moving to another place very quickly. And the other idea with holding back water, not only does it kind of create potential, for risk, because you have infrastructure there that's holding back water that has to be maintained and whatnot, it also changes the ecological function of the river. They become barriers to its fish passage, and most importantly, they're extremely expensive to maintain. We have learned that land use management, the reason why it's the cornerstone of our approach is, first of all, that it is the best way to keep people away from risks, and second of all, that you get all the ancillary benefits of a beautiful green space network like this. Now, with respect to those other two dams, one of the Clairville Dam is located right about here, and that's kind of where Toronto, Mississauga, and Brampton all meet. That's on the Humber River, so it is upstream of us. It's on the West Humber River, and so then downstream of the confluence of the West and East Humber River and Black Creek, we start to have more of the influence of these other branches of the river that are not controlled. So the majority of TRCA's watercourses do not have any form of flood control dams on them, right? Like I said, we understand why that isn't really the most sensible way in order to mitigate the risk. But the exceptions would be, there's a dam up in Woodshire Stouffville, there is the Clairville Dam, there's the G. Rossler Dam, so that's at Dufferin and Finch, basically, and that controls flood risk in the downstream area of Hoggs Hollow. And then there's also Milne Dam as well. In some cases, some dams that TRCA owns now were never actually built for flood control purposes. They were actually built, they were old mill dams that when the land acquisition occurred, we ended up kind of inheriting them. But in some cases, those dams, they weren't built for flood control, but they do provide some benefits. So we kind of have to keep some of them in place. In other places where it's possible to decommission them, then that's an alternative that we look at. So flood infrastructure kind of used to be one of the tools in the toolbox, but the issue that TRCA faces is that our risk is very distributed. There's three main reasons why solving flood risk in the Toronto region is so tricky. The first one is because our risk is distributed. So if you think about places like Winnipeg, or think about, I used to work for the city of Calgary, I think about Calgary all the time, you know, you have these much larger rivers draining a much bigger area, and the risk really stems from only one or two rivers. So if only you could do something upstream on those one or two rivers, it could solve the flood risk problem for the whole city. We don't have that situation here. We have very, very small watersheds. I mean, take the Don River watershed, that's only about 40 kilometers long. Right? And it's only about 390 square kilometers. These are teeny tiny. And when you have watersheds this small, that means where it rains is where it floods. And because of that, issues like the ninja storm that Moira alluded to, when they materialize, they can drop rain so quickly that it overwhelms not just the infrastructure, but also the natural infrastructure, because it concentrates so quickly into our rivers and streams. And so the first challenge we have is that the risk is distributed. And all of these areas in red behind me, these are all areas where we have a high concentration of structures in the floodplain. Now, we learned our lesson from Hurricane Hazel, and we've always tried to keep people and property away from the risk in new development. But there are many areas that were settled prior to land use planning. A lot of the historic downtowns. Rhianydd talked about downtown Brampton, downtown Stouffville, downtown Unionville, you know, all of these historic main streets, they were all naturally settled to river. Bolton, right? They were all next to mills, they were all historically settled. And then there's a handful of other areas where, over time, we have a better understanding of the floodplain because now we use tools like two-dimensional mapping. So now we can identify, oh, actually, if it were to happen again, this water would spill into a certain area. So now we're able to understand this. So between these two kind of situations, we have all of these areas of existing risk. So while for greenfield development, there's an amazing, you know, toolbox that we use, and land use planning is kind of first among that toolkit. What can we do for these areas of existing risk? And these flood vulnerable clusters, as we call them, they correspond to, you know, over 43,000 residents, over 41,000 employees who live within the structures within the floodplain in these areas. Over 9,900 structures is what we're talking about, over 195 kilometers of impassable road. Just like Rand talked about these main highways being, you know, cut in many places, there is so much inundation of roadways that would occur if we saw Hurricane Hazel today. And at least we have an idea of where that would be now. And the other thing is, if you actually go and add up the risk, it would amount to almost $3 billion in damages today. And so the distributed risk is the first key issue. The second key issue is that these watersheds are short, steep, and highly urbanized. When rain falls on hardscape, it runs off very, very quickly and concentrates in. And while we now use tools like low impact development and stormwater management to try to mimic the natural system, and that's one of the things that the Conservation Authority looks at, is trying to encourage stormwater management that allows raindrops to become groundwater recharge drops as opposed to flood drops. You know, there's still so many areas that were developed before we even understood how to undertake stormwater management. So the practices of engineering change, the practices of science change, the understanding of hydrology changes, and so too do the tools that we use to understand it. But if it wasn't already tricky enough, flooding can happen any time of year. Now, I also think again about Winnipeg or Calgary, and I think, you know, I was always busy, but when it came to like flood forecasting warning, in Calgary I was only really busy in the springtime. We only had one flood season. Not so here. In the Greater Toronto area, spring freshet can continue to be a time of risk when all of that snow, because snow is, after all, water once it melts. Once that snow starts to melt and you get some spring rainstorms on top of that bringing it down, spring freshet can continue to be a risk for our region, particularly in the bigger watersheds like the Humber and the Duffins. But at the same time, recently, the biggest flooding events that we've seen have been from summer thunderstorms, or even, they might not even be thunderstorms. The ninja storm was not accompanied by lightning, so it was considered a tropical downpour. You get very interesting descriptions of storms. So, thunderstorms, tropical downpours in the summertime with significant rainfall over such a short period of time, and here's the kicker, with little or no warning. These kinds of storms happen on such a small scale that weather models can't even predict if they're necessarily going to happen. You can have an idea that the elements are there. It's like having, some eggs and some flour and, I don't know if you've ever seen, Environment Canada has a cupcake watch meme and shows like a thunderstorm watch is like having all the ingredients to make a cupcake. All the ingredients to make a thunderstorm ready. But whether or not you're going to end up with the cupcake in the oven or not is hard to tell. And with thunderstorms, the issue is you probably know somewhere it's going to develop. But we don't know, is it going to happen over the Humber River watershed or is it going to happen over up on Lake Simcoe? Right? And this is what is so tricky with these summer thunderstorm events, is that if the meteorologists can't even quite forecast that because they're that localized and that kind of random as to exactly where they will fall, then we as hydrologists, as people who understand what happens to the rain, once it reaches the ground, as people, water resource engineers who understand where the water will flow once we know how much water there is in the river, it becomes very, very hard to undertake flood forecasting warning for these summer-type thunderstorms. And then, of course, we have the fall. I mean, our worst flood in history happened today, 65 years ago. So tropical storm remnants that have all of that moisture, it's warm, moist air coming up from the tropics. When they come up here and you get a cold front that comes across, or even just some of these very heavy moisture-laden storms, they can still pose a problem, and it was still to date the worst storm. And then in the wintertime, we have ice jams. So there is no, are you relaxed, Rhianydd, because flood season's, no, flood season is never over. There is some sort of threat at any time of day. There is something to lose sleep over at any time of day. So flooding can happen any time of year. And what this means, like I said, is that there is no silver bullet solution for reducing flood risk. But what we do have are many bronze ones. And this is why we look at the full spectrum of emergency management when trying to reduce flood risk. There is no single solution. So yeah, we use land use management. We look at implementing mitigation projects. A good example on that would be what's happening on the Lower Don. Right? On the Lower Don, there's going to be a whole brand new river channel that's going in. But the cost of that is $1.25 billion. And it's being pitched in by all three levels of government. And if you actually trace back the history of that, it's taken over 30 years to get to the point where we have shovels in the ground. So not only is it costly, it is a long-term initiative. So that's what we know. We are in it for the long haul. But what do we do in the meantime, right? We continue to try to target mitigation because that's where we want to go. We want permanent passive mitigation. That's the ideal standard. But to find the availability of land to even implement these measures in some places is very difficult. And the other is it's going to be a long time for some areas. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, then you could look at things in the preparedness, response, and recovery realm. You look at education and outreach. Look at what can be done at the different levels, at the individual level, at the neighborhood level. We look at our flood forecasting and warning program. We undertake public education. We train with our partner municipalities, and we take the information that we have, we put them into better flood emergency response plans, for example. And then every time we have a storm, we use the lessons learned, and we feed that information into our models, into our operating procedures to better understand. So it's not one single, there's no single solution that's going to solve the problem. But we use this full spectrum, and the foundation to be able to do this is understanding the risk. Now, a quick word of responsibility, just to clarify the Conservation Authority, and this is one of the things too. I mean, there's clarity on mandate when it comes to riverine flooding, and Hurricane Hazel gave in the aftermath of that we got clarity on mandate as it relates to riverine flooding. And so river flooding, which is when rivers overflow their banks and then go into wherever they may be, it could happen in a very urbanized area, but we still call that riverine flooding. What some people call pluvial flooding or urban flooding is when there's so much rain that it just overwhelms the local capacity of the drainage infrastructure. So that's urban or pluvial flooding. Now, there's a bit of a gap there when it relates to flood forecasting and warning because there's no particular agency that actually has the responsibility to forecast or warn for that. The infrastructure systems themselves are owned by the municipality, it's municipal infrastructure. But the forecasting and warning is kind of an area where everybody's pitching in a little bit to try to take care of it. So Environment Canada will talk a little bit about flash flooding. TRCA will remind everybody not to drive through ponded roads. Municipalities will be retweeting this and making sure that all the different transit operators know the story. So there is a little bit of a gap in terms of forecasting and warning. And also, because the mandate has always been with conservation authorities, to be able to look after riverine flooding, we've had a head start when it comes to actually mapping that risk because we've needed to do that. If we want to know where to apply land use planning, we have to know where the risk area is. So conservation authorities have been mapping risk for a very, very long time. But from an urban flooding perspective, it's a little bit trickier to do that because mapping urban flood risk is again one of those areas where there wasn't really a clear mandate for it. But there's need for it and there's an appetite for it. And one of the things that the Conservation Authority does is we share our expertise and we share any of the results of the research that we do with our municipal partners so that it can help inform however that process is going to move forward. And so I think I already talked about prevention and mitigation, but the two things I didn't talk about in here are stormwater management and the policy planning as well. Because I talked about the way that we do these models to be able to understand the risk area. But the other thing we do is try to encourage development in a manner that emulates nature. And I've talked about flood risk, but it's important to note that the Conservation Authority also looks after lake-based flood risk, after dynamic beaches, after erosion risk, as well as the conservation of natural resources like wetlands. As far as preparedness goes, I think I actually touched on both of these. Emergency planning, public education, training are the cornerstone of it. And then we do have our flood forecasting warning system. And yes, we have issued messages every day of the year. We've issued them on Christmas before. We've had tons of rain on Christmas. It happens. You know, we have ice jams. So there is a flood duty officer who is always on call. Now, they're not sitting there at their laptop the entire night if there is absolutely nothing expected. But we have these different layers of defenses. If it's thunderstorm season and, you know, some of that energy is there in the atmosphere, then yeah, they'll be on enhanced monitoring. But even when, you know, there's nothing expected, there are still some alarms that we use to kind of catch those potential ones that were not forecast for. And that was what was helpful on August 7th, 2018, as far as the river alarms go. But what was so tricky is that storm was so small that even though we have a whole network of rain gauges, even though we have a whole network of those, it was so small that it tracked in between those gauges. And so while there are other gauges, not all of them are real-time. And we have 40 real-time gauges just in the Greater Toronto area. So it really is tricky, and one of the things we're trying to do now is piggyback on other networks to bring them in. Yes?
What are these gauges? What do they look like?
I will show you a picture of those. I don't think we have it in here.
I have one on my daily one of my pictures.
Perfect. I will escape from here for a minute. You know what? Can I explain them and then we'll find a picture at the end?
Sure,
If that's okay?
great.
Perfect. So there's a couple of kinds of gauges for rain gauges. One of them is a weigh-in gauge, which is literally like, it's basically taking the weight of the precipitation that falls on it. And the other one is a tipping bucket gauge. And a tipping bucket gauge, basically as rain falls, it will kind of tip this way. And every time it tips, it clicks a sensor off. And typically they're mounted on roofs or any flat, clear area that is away from any trees, because that's kind of an ideal location in order to pick up precipitation. So you really won't see them at ground level. Most of them are mounted on roofs. But if you do, the two kind, one of them, you'll see a little box that has a modem and everything that sends the information, and then the gauge itself will kind of look like a setup like this, either with this trapezoidal bucket that will do the tipping, or it's kind of like a big pad, basically, where any precipitation that falls on it, as the weight of that is recorded, and then it gets calibrated by our field staff, who will calibrate that. So they're spread out throughout. The City of Toronto also has gauges, and then Water Survey Canada also has gauges, but some gauges are not real time. For some watersheds, you don't really need to know what happened in the last 20 minutes to know if it's going to flood. You just have to take what's happening over the course of the day. You don't even have to look at the rainfall. You just, in Winnipeg, you just have to see what's going on at Fargo and knowing how much snow has fallen over the last, the whole season in order to understand what the flood risk is. For us, we need up-to-the-minute information, because where it rains is where it floods. And this is why we have to have a strong bench of flood duty officers, most of whom are trained either in water resources engineering or earth science or have some sort of background like that, combined with experience too, right? I mean, that's certainly understanding the watersheds, they all have their personality, they all have their characteristics. So yeah, the flood duty officers, we have a model flood duty officer there. That's actually Rhianydd's husband, but he's the only person who fills out that coat height-wise. So we took a picture of him instead. But the representative flood duty officer, not all of them are that tall or handsome, but they are effective. And the flood duty officer will do a few things. We issue flood message types. So, normal is when nothing's happening. And then we have what's called a watershed condition statement. That's anytime we have high flows, we're worried about water safety. That's the first level of messaging. We're really more worried about recreational users. I want to remind people who if you're out walking your dog, maybe on the trail that's right next to the riverbank, because the river's going to be flowing high and fast. And then the other one is a watershed condition statement. That's for flood outlook, and that's when we think there's the potential for there to be, flooding in the area. And then we have a flood watch, a flood warning, and thanks to the lake, shoreline hazard warning as well. And here's the tricky thing for us. These are many levels. There's only really 4 levels of messaging, right? The shoreline hazard warning versus flood warning. One's just for the lake, one's for the rivers. So we have a few categories of warning. But how do you convey 3 different dimensions of risk? How do you convey certainty, extent, and intensity 3 different dimensions of risk with only 4 categories of warning. So the answer to that is you have to read the text. Don't just look at the colors, the details are in the text. And one of the other tools that you can use, and I'll show a screenshot of that in a minute, is our real-time gauging website. So anybody can go on and access the information from that network of both rain gauges as well as river and stream gauges. And so that is absolutely publicly available. You can look at that and do all the fun things you can with the data. I mean, we, as citizen, if there's an interest in citizen science, it's a great portal for information for that. And so these are kind of the tools that we have to work with and the risks that we have to work with. But that's all going to become further complicated when you factor in climate change. And impacts from climate change are already being felt around the world. And one of the questions that we have, and I'll look back at a few recent events, and one of the questions that we have is, is this, we always get, oh, this event right here, is this one caused by climate change? Let's look at 3 events and then I'll answer that question. So the first one was the rainstorm of July 8th, 2013, and many of you guys remember that. This was, in recent times, I'd say this has been one of the most impactful ones that we've seen in the last decade. There have been other storms. We've had some ice jam flooding earlier this year, August 7th, 2018 last year. None of these were actually as bad as the July 8th, 2013 storm. As far as insurable losses go from both river and urban flooding, it exceeded over $1 billion by IDC's estimate. So very, very impactful storm. But that's about 100 millimeters of rain. By contrast, I just want to remind everybody, Hazel was 285 millimeters of rain. Now, this is 100 millimeters of rain in about 2 hours. Hazel was 210, out of that 285, 210 millimeters of rain fell within a 12-hour time span. But this kind of flash flooding, no warning, right? Very, very little warning. It happened and then it stalled. It rained very hard in the same place for 2 hours as you had, all of this moisture-laden air. The thunderstorms got triggered, and then it was the lake breeze that it was following. And as the lake breeze collapsed through the evening, only then did it slowly start to sink, farther and farther south. And that's the worst. When we have a storm that's tracking from north to south at a slow pace, it's particularly problematic because the rain is following the flow. So it rains up here, and then that water starts to flow down, and then it rains on top of that, and then it rains on top of that, rains on top. That's particularly problematic for us. And when they line up with the lake breeze, like they do here, and they stall, and they're just so slowly tracking down, terrible combination. And so on July 8th, 2013, terrible combination from a river perspective. From an urban perspective, that's just so much rain that the capacity of municipal infrastructure to handle that kind of rain in such a short period of time is really, really difficult. And so this led to over $1 billion in insurance claims, $70 million in costs to the city. And again, these are even estimates. Like, you don't even actually, get to pick up the secondary impacts of flooding. If you look at what did it mean in terms of the people who were stranded on the GO train, what about all of their time, that they were stranded there? What about the lost project? It's not even often calculated, things like this. So that's one example of recent event. The other one was the ice storm in December 2013, widespread power outages. Again, not flood related, but again, weather related, where there was a very, very serious disruption to the power system and a huge cleanup cost after that. And then, of course, oh man, this summer, this is what kept me awake. Lake Ontario flooding. It kept me awake, but it was better than 2 years ago because we knew what we were dealing with. So 2017, 2019, Toronto islands and beaches were submerged. So 46,000 sandbags were deployed the first time around. Less sandbags. Nobody quotes the 2019 year for sandbags because it was less sandbags. Because a lot of the sand that was put in sandbags in 2017 was left in place, planted with grass, left to create a berm. So this is why we always use the 2017 number for the more impactful total sandbag count. And if you count the actual indirect damages, especially including that to the municipality in terms of loss of ferry revenue and whatnot, it's over $8.5 million in both direct and indirect damages. So the question comes up, well, that particular event, was that event related to climate change? The answer is, while it may not be possible to attribute any specific, single event to it at this time, climate change attribution is a really new study, and some cases have been done on examples like the Alberta floods, as well as on examples like the Fort McMurray wildfire. So Environment Canada has done climate attribution studies on those two events, for example, and look at how, the magnitude of impact was exacerbated by climate change. But things like these, sometimes like those thunderstorms and whatnot, those are such micro-scale events that you wouldn't even be able to pick it up on models, so you can't actually attribute it. And as far as lake levels go, there's actually a few different things that actually influence, so you can't pinpoint it. But here's what we do know. is that a change in climate is like weighting the dice. It's loading the dice so that, getting 12s, which used to be an unlikely occurrence, is getting to be more likely. And what about the possibility of rolling a 13? Because with the change in climate, you have to start wondering, is this idea of a stationary record still true? Is it still possible to just look backwards at what the climate and the weather used to do and use that information to project forward? So this is why it is so tricky. So there's things we know, things we don't, and things we can do. What do we know? And I take this, again, I am, full disclaimer, I am not a climatologist. I am a water resources engineer with a little bit of background in urban planning as well. So I'm not a climatologist, so everything I'm taking to you today is coming from what I consider to be the authoritative source for Canada, which is Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019, plus a little bit from the Toronto Climate Resilience Framework. So here's what we do know from Canada's Changing, I've got to see it, CCCR 2019. Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. And Canada is warming faster, it's actually almost twice as fast as the rest of the world, and will continue to warm much faster. And that a warmer climate, like I said, when it comes to weighting the dice or loading the dice, a warmer climate will intensify some weather extremes in the future. And more intense rainfalls will increase urban flood risks. So as you have a higher carrying capacity of, in warmer air, there's more potential moisture in there. You could get the potential for more intense rainfalls. And with sometimes slower winds and whatnot, you have the potential for some of these storms to stall. And on top of that, with multiple freeze thaws in the winter, the risk of ice jams also goes up because you're starting to have, ice cover form and then move, and then, break up, move somewhere else, form again, and you just have a longer period of time over which ice jams could happen, and then that just increases the risk of actually seeing ice jams. So yeah, there are things we know that are telling us it is not, if anything, it's going to get trickier and it's going to get worse. But what we don't know, but what we can't do right now is exactly like pinpoint and say, this is what, a storm, the 100-year storm exactly is going to look like in the future. There might be some tools that kind of claim to be able to do that, but it's hard to do that with any accuracy because most of the climate predictions happen first at a global scale, and then those have to be downscaled to a regional scale, and then here's where it gets very tricky. You have to get a model that has the right resolution, time and in space, to be able to show these kinds of events like summer thunderstorms, and they have to pick up the influence of the Great Lakes. And this is the really tricky part for our region, is trying to understand how, because the Great Lakes themselves will impact climate. Lake Reese is a perfect example of a weather phenomenon that the lake creates. There's moisture that gets picked up off of the lake effect snow, right? The Great Lakes do influence it, and so to be able to get a downscale model that includes the Great Lakes and that is looking at, calculating what happens. Because when you model, you take a big problem like this, you break it down into small chunks in space, like a grid of information, you're applying physics equations in that grid, and you also break it down into time. You kind of do that at for every 15 minutes, let's see what happens, right? And so it's very, very difficult. And so I can't tell you today, and we will continue, there are various academic sources looking at this, and, in the provincial government, there's a commitment to help provide guidance on this as well, but it just hasn't been resolved yet as to how best to do that, because the science is so tricky and so difficult and so finicky, especially taking into account the Great Lakes. And that really is one of the most difficult things, because people constantly ask us, well, show me what the map looks like with climate change. And I can't because we don't have the building blocks to get to it the way that we can with, the models that take into account the change in land use. Like, I can show you how land use has changed and how that impacts it. I can show you how the climate record to this day, including whatever we've seen in the last 30 years, has impacted it. But when I have to start to downscale, when we have to start to downscale these global models to regional models and whatnot, then you don't have the same certainty to build it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, right? That just means that it's not the kind of thing that you can pinpoint and say, it's a very deterministic, like if A, then B, then C. What we do know then is that we have to prepare for a bigger variety, right? We have to prepare for a greater variety of weather possibilities, and that's true for higher highs, but that's true for lower lows. That also factors in if you're thinking about drought. That also factors in if you're thinking about low lake levels, not just high lake levels. And we also have to be prepared for unseasonable weather. This idea that looking back at the climate and thinking certain things only happen at certain times of year, that we have to look forward and not necessarily expect those things. So my season of four, flood season is still going to be year round, but ice jam season might extend a little bit longer, might be very shorter, and what I used to call summer thunderstorms might be 8 months out of the year thunderstorms. So that's the thing that we have to look at. And again, it comes back to this idea that there will be just like with our geography, there are no silver bullets, the same is true with our climate. There are no silver bullets. So you have to look at a multi-pronged approach to resilience. And hey, doesn't this slide look familiar again? Right? It's that same idea. When you're dealing with uncertainty, you have to look at it and recognize that everybody has a part to play. And that includes at the individual level as well. And so, when I talked about this, I said, these are the different tools that we use to approach it, but understanding risk is foundational. And so one of my favorite, but the baby, before I literally went away and had a baby and then I came back to this project, the baby, the first baby was a flood risk assessment and ranking project. And that's where we took all of our floodplain information, that's the hazard, which has a probability extent associated with it. And we looked at the exposure, we took stock of all the buildings. I gave you that number, 9,900, buildings of floodplain. I even told you our estimate. So this is not exactly a census count of who all lives in the building, but it is an estimate based on municipal property assessment corporation data layered with where we didn't have that piece of information, planning assumptions as well. So we took stock of the buildings, the population at risk, and then we used the latest in damage assessments to be able to look at, among these 41 clusters in our city, what does it look like structure by structure damages? And what about things that we can't put dollar values on, right? How do we look at that? So we had our consultant join with stakeholder input as well as our information and come up with a rank. If you want more information, you can check out the minutes that will come up from our next board report, and I'll do a presentation on just this project there. But the point is that we took these different elements of risk model, put a lot of effort into building up that data to come up with risk ranking. And so here are the top, I guess I skipped, the top 10 within TRCA's jurisdiction. Because we also have to do this in a uniform way, in a uniform way for all of our jurisdiction, because some partner municipalities have some data, some don't. So, we kind of went through it, and these are the top 10. If you take a look at this, 2 of these are top 2 are in the Humber watershed. In fact, they're actually on Black Creek. Black Creek has a really small drainage area, highly urbanized drainage area, and like I said, in some of these neighborhoods, like in Rockcliffe, for example, settled, in an area that is right next to a very, very narrow channel. And so in some of these areas, though, that's bad news. The good news is that there are efforts underway, in many of these neighborhoods to try to look at remediation. But remediation takes time, right? So in Rockcliffe, there is a feasibility study. In Dixie Dundas, there's an environmental assessment going on in there. In the Lower Don, as we know, there's the big Portland Flood Protection Project. In Markham Industrial, Don Mills Ditch, we met with them this morning. They're going to there's a whole series of infrastructure improvements that recently received Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. So we are continuing to chip away at the mitigation on it, but like I said, it's the long haul, right? And if you think about how long it takes, just think again for Lower Don. From the times of the Attribution plan, back in the 1980s to where we are now, where we finally have shovels in the ground, it's been a long time. And I want to just point out that one of the ways that happened was there was excellent community support for it, right? So, I just want to acknowledge that happened because there was such a desire to bring back the Dawn, such a drive from, the people and people who had an interest in seeing that restored. So I just want to underscore that importance. But in the meantime, we use that same study, while we're looking at ranking this, we use that same study to try to look at different kinds of mapping, right? So we had hazard mapping, so now we take hazard mapping and we intersect some of that information with, there, inundation mapping, right? And that then you can also start to look at that, and when you take inundation mapping, you intersect it with exposure information, you get risk mapping. And so this is some of the mapping that helps us understand and helps us work on emergency response planning, for example. So Rockcliffe is the first neighborhood that we're working with the City of Toronto on in order to get enhanced emergency planning. Yes?
You mentioned the value of the interest groups in pushing for the Lower Don over 30 years. It's very hard for community groups and interests to mobilize on risk assessment or disaster planning or anything in the future, because that's normally thought of as an expert's issue. But you also mentioned the ecological benefits of wetlands, and for example, this is spawning season. If those dams that are currently in place, if there were any kind of infrastructure planning for ameliorating the ways in which the levels are controlled so that the salmon don't have to climb 6 feet instead of maybe only 3 or 4, if that kind of, let me not call it educational, but that kind of ecological focus of the conservation authorities, which is really part of your mandate, not just risk and infrastructure planning and urban planning, but mobilizing in terms of getting people interested on an everyday level. I mean, kids are interested in this, but they're not interested in risk. They can't be part of the experts panel.
That's a really, and actually, I'm certainly putting the focus on the flood risk side of it, because that's, my area of expertise. But one of the benefits of the Conservation Authority model is that there are people whose task it exactly is. You do have ecologists sitting in the same building as water resource engineers sitting in the same building as planners. And one of the benefits is that. So some examples I can think of are with the dams, it's really tricky. And one of the things about the dams is they're not made for hydropower. These are all flood, they're flood control dams, meaning that they're not, keeping the reservoir behind it. They're really just generally empty behind the reservoir, as empty as can possibly be, leaving the room to allow them to fill up. But it's actually, it's not so much the regulation and flow themselves, it's just truly the structure itself that tends to provide the biggest impediment towards fish. So there are, fish ladders are put in, and where possible, we even look at, is it possible to decommission the dam? Is it possible to kind of create a more naturalized solution? And, where it is possible, we do pursue those. In some cases, it just, when you actually undertake it, you end up, by doing so, creating an adverse impact to public safety, and in general between the two, public safety will trump as it should, right? So we do try to, and one of the benefits is that, unfortunately, you're probably right, I'm not really talking about the work that our Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program does, or that our partners in Project Green does, or that our education department does by getting kids out to each of these camps and looking at doing, fish counts and bird counts and whatnot. And, I'm not the best person to give that message, but there is certainly an arm of the Conservation Authority, several arms, in fact, that do look to do that. And there's great value to it, and I do wish that everybody, saw that value as well.
My point was not to criticize what the staff are doing, it's just to point out that this is political. The way you mobilize interest and on a continuing basis, if you have stuff that's of interest to people who can do something about it, and we can talk about it, picnics, and salmon viewings and stuff. But it's not as, I'm not interested in trying to criticize the engineering department.
No, I recognize that.
Conservation Authority.
No, understood. And luckily there is usually a salmon run festival and that you can check out. So I will share details of that while we look, when Rhianydd is looking up for the picture, to help share some of those, that do breed a better connection. So Humber by Canoe is another good example. I don't know if anybody got a chance, to check that out. But you're absolutely right. You have to foster an emotional connection, to these places, and that is what makes it, tick. And like I said, I look at it from the risk, but you're right. When people look at it, they see cherished green space. They see cherished, habitat. They're out there because they want to canoe on the river. They want to see the salmon run. That's a very, very good point. And something we should, carry in our education as well, is that not only do we look at reducing risk, at the same time, you're preserving these very special places, and people have those memories and those personal relationships to that. So thank you. And that can help inform how we do outreach, because yes, we do need to continue to do outreach, and all of that data that we gathered, does go into whether it's our public outreach plan, our site-specific response plan, because it comes back to this issue, we don't have lead time. So we're focusing our efforts, and all of that information that was helped in our risk ranking, we're working on the next generation of flood forecasting tools, looking at things like radar, looking at things like, real-time flow estimates that work at the time scale that we need. Because if you look at, again, big rivers, you can just see what's happening in the river flow and get an understanding of flood potential just based on the change in flow rate. In ours, we don't. We have to look at what rain is falling like right now and what's on the radar. And so trying to take this information into new models is one of the things we're looking at. And then the other two projects we have on the go right now in our little department is public outreach, which Rhianydd is leading, and then site-specific response plans. And here is that network. Oh, there's a picture. What do you know? There are pictures of, that's a rain gauge over there. And then the other one is just, so the lower one's a rain gauge and the upper one's a stream gauge. So yes, we do have one in there. And as you can see, the rain gauge is mounted. You can see that that's mounted on a rooftop, right? So typically you want it on a large flat area. You have to have a solar panel to power it. And then inside that little metal enclosure is the modem, because this is feeding information to us. Rain gauges every 5 minutes and stream gauges every 15 minutes. And so, this is our network of real-time rain and stream gauges, and you too can look at them if you're interested. You can go to TRCA but that's kind of an old visualization. We have a very sexy looking new tool where if it starts to cross over thresholds, you'll start to see these icons turn amber and then red as it starts to cross over worse thresholds. You can put the radar on top of that. You can see how much rain is falling. And if you only care about 4 or 5 gauges in your neighborhood, you can make your own dashboard to just look at that. So for this visualization, go to beta.trcaengaging.ca. And I did talk about our flood forecasting decision support system. Now we're trying to look at kind of the latest in, flow forecasting. But again, like I said, these are really hard to calibrate because there's that uncertainty in the weather. So then to try to get, a flood model that performs well, a real-time flood model, because we do all the modeling for hypothetical events to get our floodplain mapping. But to do a real-time flood model, it takes a lot of calibration and effort. So we are working on that though, because we've got to, because it's only going to get trickier. And then I just want to end on lake-based flooding, because I know we're primarily talking about the river, but this was a big story this year. So just super, super quick. The 3 factors that influence Lake Ontario levels: inflow from Lake Erie, uncontrolled. There's no, Niagara Falls does have power generation, but there's nothing holding that water back. The other one is precipitation or snowmelt from Lake Ontario, so any rain that falls over the lake or our surrounding rivers, which all drain to Lake Ontario in TRCA's jurisdiction. And then the third factor that does control it is the outflow out of the lake. And the outflow is managed. It is a joint water body by the International Joint Commission, and it's managed in such a way that when the Ottawa River is flooding, and the Ottawa River watershed is in yellow, if the Ottawa River peak flows come in at the same time as St. Lawrence peak flows, Montreal floods in a devastating way. And so the outflow from Lake Ontario is managed a little bit to try to avoid those peaks coming in at the same time. And so anytime, there is an Ottawa River, and they have record flooding both years, right? If both of those peaks hit Montreal at the same time, it's devastating. And so there are certain rules set in place that the International Joint Commission follows in order to help manage the upstream risks as well as the downstream risks. But it isn't, just one single thing. I mean, in this case, the outflow from Lake Ontario did get throttled at one point to help the Ottawa River peak flows pass, but then it was opened right up again. But then we had more inflow from Lake Erie than ever before because Lake Erie was at a record high this year. And so we had this very, very prolonged situation of even longer high lake levels than in 2017. So up there you can see 2019 in the black, 2017 in the gray, and then the old average in blue over there. But of course, when you have extreme events like this, it changes what that average, would be, right? And so, it starts to skew all of them upwards right there. So we did have it. We had very, very high, even higher lake levels. The average lake level was 75.93, like the 24-hour average at Toronto in 2017. This year, 75.95, so slightly higher. And then some peak, just with some wave action and some of what they call the seiche, where water sloshes back and forth inside any closed water. But think about a fishbowl, right? If you give it, a little shake one where if you blow, the wind is blowing across the lake and then it lets up, then there's kind of this restabilization. It's called seiche. It's kind of an oscillation back and forth. Yeah.
The level in 1954 is not available in the record.
So 1954, this is Lake Ontario. So 1954, Hurricane Hazel was the worst flooding for riverine perspective. So that, if you think about this map, Hurricane Hazel kind of fell right over here, right? It's all of these things over the course of a season draining to Lake Ontario that result in peak levels. And so if you look at the Lake Ontario follows a seasonal rise and fall. So you can't see my months, sorry, I cut off the months on the bottom. But I'm gonna say if this is, about June, oh, well this is pretty close to where we were. This is October here, right? So the lake itself is already into kind of its seasonal decline by the time all the water from Hurricane Hazel fell onto it. So riverine flood risks are based on a weather event. Lake-based flood risks are based on seasonal factors. So it's about how much snowpack there was in the Ottawa River, because that's going to impact the outflow. It's about how much rain is falling in the area in blue over the course of the season, because all that's draining to Lake Ontario. And it's about what's coming in from Lake Erie. So lake-based flooding for us is seasonal rise and fall. River-based flooding is related to each and every weather system that we have. So there's a little bit of a relation to how wet the soil was before. Does that help answer your question? So I don't have 1954 on there, but it wasn't, the different dynamics to issue them, and so I don't recall it being a particular.
They not have they started the work at that time.
So no, they've been mapping lake levels since 1918, and in fact the reason why these are not actually points but little bars is because they would check it twice monthly, because it doesn't, the lake level, it doesn't shoot up the way, Hurricane Hazel, the river level will shoot up in a matter of hours, right? Lake level will go like, little by little by, millimeter by millimeter by millimeter. It's a big water body, right? So they were recording lake levels. It was probably seasonally high at the time, but it wasn't, it wasn't at the time where these seasonal factors coincide to get your seasonal peak level, which typically happens in, in about May, June, right? So this year it was actually worse, and the worst part is it lasted longer. It lasted so much longer. So when you're this high already, and you're high for a long time, anytime you get any of these bad winds out of the east, then you get storm surge, you get these really choppy winds, you can get wave impacts. So the odds that you're not just going to have high still lake level, but you're going to have wave and surge added to that is higher. So it's actually worse, in terms of the way the lake behaved this year, much worse. But most people didn't realize it because there was a greater degree of preparation, right? In 2017, none of us had seen high lake levels like this in a generation. But in 2017, the relationships were built, the tools were put in place, the sumps, were installed in the following fall and whatnot, so that the impact was not as well felt. And so in this case, while the Conservation Authority does not do boots on the ground, right? Our role is as a technical advisor to the municipalities. The municipality, in a lake, there is, and we know there's no time to sandbag. In river flooding, there isn't, right? It rains and then it floods. So sandbagging is not an effective tool for riverine flood risk. But for lake-based flood risk, it is, because it inches up little by little. So you can actually sandbag, you can actually, do something as far as temporary mitigation measures go, and some of those were left in place to be semi-permanent, and now, the work is continuing on that. But we support on the ground by providing expertise there, and we also work by providing some co-mapping, which was used in the Emergency Operations Center. Oh, sure. And even this year, which was helpful, and we share that information with the International Joint Commission, which is also looking at, with the International Joint Commission, which is trying to look at what does it mean, when there's this balancing of upstream and downstream risks, what does it mean for, Lake Ontario shoreline? We certainly, share that information with them. And then we're looking at long-term mitigation measures, because again, that is the goal. Ideally, you want to look towards long-term mitigation measures, but, it doesn't happen overnight, right? And so in the interim, just like it was with the lake, even in 2017, the ball got rolling for long-term mitigation measures, but next event happened before those could be put in place, and we knew it would. So that's why response planning was one of the tools that we used, and those relationships with our municipal partners were used to be able to manage that risk, even though it was actually a worse threat from the lake itself. And so, we're always learning every time, and, we have to continue to use this variety of tools in our toolbox, and I hope that this was helpful to you. And I always think back that Hurricane Hazel was a devastating event, but it really, it taught us a lesson. There are nowhere else in the country uses, has the same, thank you so much, has the same approach to flood risk management, as us. The closest people who might be the Dutch with their water boards, and even their cutting edge, tactic is called room for the river. And room for the river is exactly what we've been doing, because we learned that lesson from Hurricane Hazel. So with that, we'll thank you.
I have two questions. The first one is on Black Creek. It's got that concrete bottom to it. I realize the concrete sides are there as well. Is there any thought of going in and chopping the concrete out of the bottom so at least there can be some natural absorption? That's one question. The other question, I understand that some of the erosion on the lakeside of the islands as a result of that Leslie spit not allowing the natural flow of the sands to come back to keep them built to the level that they need to be, is there any thought of working to put like culverts or something that could allow some of that to happen again naturally?
Okay, I'll answer those in order. With Black Creek, so the tricky thing about Black Creek is channel bottoms themselves, remember, if concrete's really not ideal for any absorption or anything like that, but the one thing it does do well is it handles erosion. And the velocities in such a narrow channel are so high that you need, whatever the bottom is going to be, has to be erosion resistant. Now, looking at it, you can't just look at changing what the bottom is. Deepening can help, and there are other measures, but really the issue is that vertical constraint, because when it's so vertically constrained, then the velocities coming through there are so fast that if whatever's on the bottom doesn't have the right kind of, isn't hard enough to protect against erosion, it'll just get scraped right out, and it'll build up, it'll pile up that sediment somewhere else where the velocity slows down, and it'll end up dropping all that sediment there. So it's not necessarily ideal, but that being said, you have to, it's not, all I'm saying is that you can't just do one thing without looking at what you can do to the channel as a whole. So currently the study underway, the Black Creek Channel it's not just a TRCA study because it's so constrained, you have to work with transportation because there's two lanes of roads on either side, right? And so right now the idea is to work with transportation and look at tools. When the old EA was done, it was trying to achieve the Hurricane Hazel level of protection. But the thing to remember is that if it's either Hazel level or nothing, then there would be many properties that would be left in the floodplain, and those are the ones at highest risk because it's the properties adjacent to the vertical wall, sidewall channel that are at the higher risk because they're the most low-lying right next to that channel. And so now let's look at it a different way and look at what can be done to reduce the risk. And is there the possibility of extending into what is currently a transportation infrastructure in order to create more space to do something? So that's something that, it's a combined feasibility study with the City of Toronto Transportation, TRCA, and Toronto Water that's looking at that. But with respect to the idea of absorbing on the bottom, the absorbency, the infiltration is important on the tablelands. It's important where the rain falls. But when you have a very, very narrow channel like that, it is important, no matter what you do, to make sure that you're not putting something in that will get kind of scoured out. Because if it starts to scour out, it can start to undermine the walls on the side of it as well and cause failure. Oh, you had another question, erosion. So there's something called the Gibraltar Point Erosion Control Project. So I might refer you to that project website as well, which is trying to put in basically underwater structures that are erosion, that'll break the momentum of the waves, allowing them to do more deposition rather than ripping up the sand.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Years ago, TRCA used to buy up property that was in the floodplain and then turn it into park space. Do you still do that?
It only occurs right now, so our green space master plan kind of looks at that, and it doesn't, there's no kind of expropriation or anything like that happens. It's more when a property comes up for sale and it is, it meets the criteria in the green space master plan, and there's a willing buyer, willing seller, relationship, and it makes sense. Then there's kind of target properties that come up. So it occurs in a piecemeal fashion if, at the time that transfer would make sense.
Do you have a fund for that though?
There's some, but it's, again, so then everything in the green space master plan gets kind of weighed, but the idea of a large scale buyout, there is no funding.
Well, I understand that because you have to wait for them to come for sale.
Well, no, but even there's not, it's not a well-funded program, no.
Just to point out,
Yeah.
there is one thing that happens now. If you live in York, there are a lot of ravine lots where the ravine is actually owned by the local residents. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, generally in a plan of subdivision, the ravine lands are given to TRCA as part of the development plan. So the ravine access is no longer that of the private homeowner, but is part of TRCA. And that does guarantee the land will remain green and it will allow absorption, which does not happen now. There are, especially in York, people are paving the ravines. They're cutting down all the trees, and the city doesn't seem to want to enforce the bylaw. And you can just walk around here anywhere and you can find places where the ravine has been paved over.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as far as kind of when there is a plan of subdivision, at that time there's typically the opportunity to undertake a separate, but it has to be in an already existing planning process for that to happen. Yes?
You showed that map of your 10 risk areas.
Yeah.
Would your mandate go as far as to say to the building department, hey, maybe that's not a good place to build a basement apartment or something like that? I mean, you know, we can be proactive like that, especially, you know, with the building code to make places that even if they do get wet, it's not so bad. I mean, I grew up in the city of Toronto, nobody had a finished basement. Now everybody has a finished basement, so when there is a flood, it's a big problem. Back in the day, the basement flooded, it'll go out. Throw a little soap in there.
So you raised two good points. So first is absolutely we do, so anything that is within our regulated area, we do get, those applications do come across. Are we finishing from a basement that wasn't finished to finish? We probably would never see it, to be honest. It's only the ones that kind of meet the criteria. So anything that's in the floodplain, it does come across for plan review anytime there's any sort of intensification. Now, something like a finishing, that it's not
Well, I
really
speak
planned
of
out.
Rockcliffe specifically, because
Yeah.
that's an area going under tremendous redevelopment. Those post-war bungalows are being topped up and they're being made huge. And being in the building industry myself, the reason people finish basements is because it's free square footage.
Right, yeah, totally.
So you can also give them, hey, don't finish your basement, we'll give you extra footage above grade so you don't lose anything and everybody wins.
Yeah, that's a good question about how to kind of get that discouragement out of there. Anywhere that's a special policy area though, technically, right, you are not, like some of it isn't actually, you know, working through the system, you know, if you get what I mean. Like, you know, anywhere that is a special policy area, there are kind of regulations on what you can, and absolutely that's not, you know, bad ideas in floodplains, reverse sloping driveways, you know, finished basements, you know, without any flood protection around them, right? There are all of these, but not everything qualifies at, you know, is considered at the level at which it would come into our review. So when it does cross our desk, absolutely. But I think engaging with the building industry and engaging directly with the public is a great way, because there are little lot level fixes that individuals can do, right, in order to build resilience around their homes. So yeah, from the outreach angle, absolutely. And when we talked to, you know, when we met with the Provincial Flood Advisor, we talked about that, like, there are a few things that are not in a plan review, but they are in a building code requirement that would be worthwhile. So we have raised those, you know, to individuals who are undertaking kind of that kind of
You know, I'm going to take just a moment here to say thank you. You know, I thought I knew a lot about Hurricane Hazel. Turns out there was a lot more to learn, and I'm going to say thank you to 1, 2, and 3 ladies who have made a tremendous presentation tonight. I have enjoyed, I have learned. One thing that I would say, when I was out in Victoria visiting my son, they took me to see what looked like a large grassy area, but it had cars parked on it. And he said, actually, it was a car park. And it had a grid they dug down and put in a grid that was, you know, with squares, then covered it with soil and sod. And it would hold a car, you could drive over it, you could park your car on top, but it was like a large grassy area, and it was fully permeable for rain. I thought, what a wonderful idea, because so much of our problems that we're building in is how we're paving over everything. This provided the parking for a large number of cars, but it looked like a wonderful grassy parkland, and it served the purpose of solving the problem of a parking lot that would do everything around for. So there are some solutions. Now, I'm not sure about how cost effective, except that we have to bite the bullet and do some of these things, I think. But I'm so encouraged that you're doing, but we live in perilous times, don't we? Anyway, quite apart from that, we have a small thank you from the Heritage York. This was a book that we published, and there's one for each one of you to add to your libraries. And I just want to say thank you and how very much I have enjoyed, and I'm sure everybody here has too.